Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling, and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. Hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving, and maybe you're still recovering, so take the next 30 minutes to sit back and enjoy the show we've got for you today. And beginning the broadcast, this year's weather hasn't made it easy for forage producers. Between the drought and the frost, Nebraska may see a forage shortage, which means more planning is in order.
The majority of Nebraska has already seen frost covering their fields. Nebraska Extension Educator Troy Walz says nitrate levels may be something producers should watch out for.
So frost interferes with our normal plant growth, and it can cause nitrates to accumulate in plants that are still growing, especially grasses like oats, millet, sorghums, and Sudan grass. And if we have high nitrates present in these plants when they undergo a total killing freeze, that nitrate level will remain in those plants. So nitrates occur naturally in all forages. At low levels, nitrates may be excreted, or bacteria in the rumen can convert them into microbial protein. However, when we start getting high levels, they can sicken or kill a cow. So we have to be cautious at that point. And some plants are more likely to be high in nitrates than others are. These include cane, millets, oats, and also weeds such as pigweed, kochia, and lamb's quarters. And if we're grazing some droughty corn residue, even that corn residue and that corn stalks can be high in nitrates.
Troy recommends having the forage tested in a lab to make sure it's safe for consumption. Slowing down the intake rate can also make nitrate-heavy forage safer for cattle. In addition to nitrate concerns, the late summer drought could also be causing forage shortages across the state.
First thing is reduce forage demand for the upcoming fall and winter. So if you think you do not have enough feed or forage to get through the winter, maybe if you've pregnancy tested your yearling heifers and cows, and if you have some early shipping of calves, if you haven't shipped your calves off yet, or if you've backed around calves and do not sell until after the first of the year, maybe this is a time you might consider shipping those calves a little earlier. And like I said, if you've done some pregnancy testing, you can cull those non-pregnant heifers and cows, and that can help significantly reduce that forage demand that you have on your ranch. Second thing you can do is find and secure some other forage resources. Evaluate whether it may be best to bring the feed to the cattle or even the cattle to the feed. Corn residue for grazing is one way. If you can find some corn stalks to graze, that's a forage resource. Cover crops, if you can find some cover crops to graze, and these can be used to replace hay. And the other thing is when you have hay, minimize waste during feeding. So when feeding, research has shown that certain types of bale feeders, along with time limiting access of cattle to hay feeders, can reduce waste. And for cattle being fed in a dry lot, this can be helpful to efficiently utilize the hay or forage that you have. Another option for your cow herd is limit feeding those cows. Limit feeding is when the cows are fed a diet containing ingredients that are energy and protein dense, which meet the cow's nutrient requirements, but the cow is restricted on how much she can eat. Energy and protein dense feeds can be fed with low quality forage to help stretch limited supplies. And the last thing I will talk about is test your hay or your forage. If you know the nutrient content of your hay or forage, this will help you with ration formulation to ensure that you are meeting your cattle's nutrient requirements. And having an accurate analysis is important in developing a cost-effective feeding strategy on your ranch or farm.
Lastly, Troy says nutrient needs should be the priority.
I guess the one thing I just like to remind producers, if we have a bad winter, it gets cold, we get lots of snow, or if we have our corn residue gets iced over and cattle aren't even able to go out and graze to get to that forage, we need to make sure we're meeting the nutrient needs of our cow herd. Because if we do not meet the nutrient needs of our cow herd and they lose a lot of condition, we can have problems with calving in the spring.
Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Maddie McIntosh.
If you need help either testing your forage or assessing your options, Remember, as always, you can contact your local extension office for assistance. Time for markets now, and in place of our usual market interview, we're speaking with several analysts to find out what they're watching as we head into the end of 2020. We'll also look ahead to 2021. For Iowa State University Extension economist Chad Hart, international relations and how President-elect Joe Biden handles trade with China will be important in setting the tone with a new administration.
I'm definitely watching, like say, the trade picture, the export picture. Because as we look right now, that has been the storyline of the past, especially 3 months. And a lot of that is linked with China. And so I think as we look at going into 2021, especially if we do have a new administration in the White House, trade will become forefront in terms of agriculture throughout 2021, and especially how we move forward with China. I think, we have this phase 1 deal. Right now, the sales we're seeing are very supportive of saying, hey, that phase 1 deal is at least creating business for us right now. But the question really becomes, what does phase 2 look like, and how is agriculture a part of that mix? When I'm looking here, and especially thinking about the players here, I see phase 2 really concentrating on removing some of those tariffs that had been building up over the past couple of years that will hopefully foster even more growth in our agricultural trade.
Moving over to cattle, 2020 was a year of price volatility and adapting on the fly. That was especially true with meat processing plant disruptions in the spring due to the coronavirus outbreak. Months later, the plant disruptions are in the rearview mirror, but concerns remain with COVID numbers increasing in many rural areas. Here's Mississippi State University livestock economist Josh Maples.
Yeah, there's obviously still a concern, but I do think that we're certainly better prepared now to avoid those massive disruptions from the spring that you mentioned. Packing plants have testing protocols in place and a lot of other protocols. A lot of effort has been put in place to try to minimize the risk of those widespread disruptions again. And I think that, I feel like we're certainly better prepared to hopefully avoid those really massive disruptions we saw earlier and to help prevent some of those outbreaks that we saw in the packing plants. So concerning, Troy, is a good way to put it, but I do believe that we're in a better shape to hopefully not see the level of disruption that we saw in the spring.
Oklahoma State University livestock specialist Daryl Peel adds that pandemic concerns won't be around forever and hopes producers can spend next year in a more stable environment.
As we look ahead to 2021, we're going to continue with the situation coming out of 2020. It's not going to change immediately going into 2021. We certainly hope as we move through the year that we'll see some things in terms of the broader public health issues and so on settle down a little bit. But, again, from a cattle industry perspective, we're cautiously optimistic that we can see a modest increase in prices based on tighter supply fundamentals. It all hinges really on demand, and there's a lot of things that could affect that demand negatively, but assuming that doesn't happen, we're in a position to see a little bit more stability and a little bit stronger prices in 2021.
Finally, the dairy industry came into 2020 with high hopes, but reality soon set in after the pandemic forced the closures of schools and restaurants. Some farmers even had to dump milk they couldn't sell. Nebraska Extension dairy educator Kim Clark explains how we got here and what's ahead.
End of 2019 going into 2020, this year looked phenomenal for the dairy industry. We saw an increase in milk prices, a projection of an increase in milk prices that were really going to benefit the industry. And then COVID hit. So very quickly we saw the milk industry, the prices dropped again. So then that caused concern for the whole industry and farmers. Once the shutdown happened, restaurants closed down, schools closed down. So then the different processors that were using the milk, since they shut down, we didn't have a place for the milk to go. And so that really impacted the dairy industry. So then producers were left needing to dump milk. So whether it went into their lagoon system, whether they fed it to their calves or other animals, Spreading it on the field was an option. They were really trying to be economic and determine how can I use this milk rather than watching my hard-earned dollars go down the drain. So producers did a great job of stepping in and saying, how can I use my milk? But then at the same time, we also had other producers say, really evaluate their operations to determine, am I on the right path? Do I need to decrease my herd size? Is now the time I've been thinking about selling out? Is now the time that I need to sell out? So very quickly, we saw some changes within the dairy industry. But now 6 months later, we're starting to see milk prices come back around. The industry overall kind of leveled out. And so hopefully we're back to what would be normal operating conditions at this point.
Thanks to all our analysts. Next week, we'll be joined by DTN's Todd Holtman. If you have a question you'd like for me to ask him, email us or get in touch on social media, and I'll pass your question along. Next up, as 2020 winds down, there's a number of important program enrollment application deadlines to be aware of. One of the big ones is an extension of the original Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, otherwise known as CFAP-2. It was born out of the need to help producers who have been negatively impacted due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The deadline is fast approaching, and producers are urged to apply as soon as possible.
Most Nebraska crops and livestock actually are eligible for that CFAP-2 program, and the deadline for producers to apply is December 11th, so just a couple weeks away. We want to be sure that producers realize, we did a CFAP-1 earlier this year. The CFAP-2 is a separate and distinct program from CFAP-1. And so if you want assistance through CFAP-2, you do need to come back in and reapply for that program if you haven't already. There are a few differences between CFAP-1 and CFAP-2. We added a few new commodities this time around. So particularly sugar beets and dry edible beans both became eligible commodities under CFAP-2. When they weren't necessarily in the program under CFAP-1. So that's an important change for producers to be aware of.
Also due by December 11th is the application for the Dairy Margin Coverage, or DMC. This is a risk management tool that's available to dairy producers across Nebraska. This program is the replacement for the Margin Protection Program for dairy and continues to offer protection to dairy producers when margins fall below a certain dollar amount selected by the producer.
It looks at the all milk price and the feed costs, and producers can select a level of protection against that margin, to mitigate some of the risks that they have. So dairy producers who haven't yet looked at that program need to talk to their county farm service agency office and get in and complete their application for the 2021 production season. They can go online. There is on FSA's website a dairy decision tool where they can plug in some information, and that will help them determine maybe what level of coverage they want through that program. The basic level of coverage through DMC is actually no cost to the producer other than a $100 administrative fee. And then there's some premiums associated with additional buy-up coverage.
And while coronavirus was dominating the headlines much of the year, as we discussed earlier in the show, some Nebraska producers were also dealing with severe drought. Those conditions eventually triggered 27 Nebraska counties to qualify for the Livestock Forage Disaster Program, or LFP. This program seeks to mitigate any grazing losses suffered during the normal grazing period.
So the U.S. Drought Monitor is used as a trigger for that Livestock Forage Disaster Program, and those 27 counties that triggered during the 2020 grazing season are mostly located in the northeast part of the state, southwest part of the state, and in the Panhandle. And so producers of livestock located in those areas should contact their county farm service agency to determine whether their county for sure did trigger for the program, and then complete the application paperwork in order to receive some financial resources that are available to them to help mitigate some of those grazing losses that they endured. The deadline actually to enroll in livestock forage program isn't until the end of January of 2021. So there is some time for producers to get in.
And last, but certainly not least, it's time for producers to begin thinking about the upcoming 2021 production season and make their selection between ag risk coverage and price loss coverage, ARC and PLC. These programs are a commodity crop safety net that was introduced in the 2018 Farm Bill. It gives producers the chance to take a look at previous selections and determine whether or not to stick with their current enrollment or opt for the alternative.
Producers have previously made a selection between an ARC and PLC, and that selection was applicable for the 2019 and 2020 production season. If they don't make a new election, the elections that they've made for 2019 and 2020 will roll over for that 2021 season. But regardless of whether they make a new election or not, we do need to have them come in and complete the paperwork for enrollment for that 2021 upcoming season. But we want producers, now that they're done with harvest for the most part, they maybe got some time to take a look at the ARC and PLC programs and make a determination what they want to do and get that paperwork completed with their county office.
Again, the deadlines for these programs are fast approaching. CFAP and dairy margin coverage applications are due by December 11th. LFP enrollment applications are due by January 30th. ARC and PLC enrollment must be completed by March 15th. If you'd like more information on these programs, we've included several links on the Market Journal website. Next up, for Nebraska farmers, ranchers, and ag landowners, 2020 hasn't been all bad. For the past several years, the Nebraska unicameral legislature wrapped up without passing any kind of property tax relief. However, this summer, the legislature voted 41-4 to approve LB 1107. Its passage has been dubbed the Great Compromise by several ag organizations. LB 1107 provides property tax relief for ag landowners and leaves the existing property tax credit relief fund intact. Read about the provisions included in the bill and the collaboration that ultimately led to its passage in the November Nebraska Farmer. Time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Al, hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving. How's the forecast looking?
Well, Troy, we did have a nice, good Thanksgiving at our house, and I hope that most of the folks across the state were able to at least enjoy somewhat of a semblance of a halfway normal Thanksgiving given the current COVID situation across the United States. But more importantly, we at least had a decent precipitation event earlier in the week, particularly across portions of south central, southeast, and east central Nebraska, although the dividing line between the haves and the have-not was pretty sharp. Overall, we've seen anywhere from 1/4 inch to 3/4 of an inch general coverage within this region. As we got into extreme southeastern Nebraska, southern Nemaha County, Pawnee County, and Richardson County, all the observation reports we had with the storm system were anywhere between 1 inch and up to 2.5 inches in the far extreme southeastern portion of Richardson County. So they were the big winners. Unfortunately, western Nebraska, we've seen the precipitation totals were exceptionally light, with many areas, particularly the northwest and north central, and parts of western half of the northeastern part of the state really went out without any significant precipitation, essentially a trace or less. So we did get some moisture. We need to see more moisture. Unfortunately, the models aren't very conducive in bringing a bunch of moisture into our region. I think the biggest uncertainty in this forecast will be how the upper air low that is expected to form across the southern Rockies during the middle of next week performs as it moves toward the east. That'll have a big bearing on our temperature. So let's get a look at the forecast as we see it according to the newest models. And what we will notice is that we have this upper air cutoff low in the southern stream, and here's our main jet stream pattern, keeping the cold air shuttled up to the east or to the north of us. So we're expecting high pressure to be the dominant force across the central plains. A very nice day. Get out and enjoy it. We'll probably be across the 50s most of the state. Main precipitation band remains to our south. But more importantly, as we go into tomorrow, we see that northern stream trough digging, absorbing that upper air low across the south as high pressure itself moves into the state during the second half of the day, leading to a pretty significant cool down compared to what we've been experiencing recently. The main precipitation pattern itself moves off into the south central portion of the country. That trough continues to remain in play as we go into Monday, bringing the cool air down into our region. So we're going to be looking at highs on Monday. They're probably going to be in the lower 40s to upper 30s. And that precipitation pattern itself moves off into the eastern United States. So by the time we get into Tuesday, we start to see the development of another upper air low. I'm not so confident about this, but it has started to appear in the models. that is expected to just slowly drift toward the east. So we're going to be under the influence of high pressure here in the central United States. And we should see a slight raise in our temperatures, probably a couple degrees. We're looking at mid-40s to possibly up around the 50s in the southwest. This low basically sticks a little bit farther to the south. It is going to increase our flow from the south. And into the northwest part of the state, we got the high pressure moving into our region. So we're going to stay pretty consistent, maybe just a slight cool down if we can get some of that cold air from the north into our region. But in terms of precipitation, there just really isn't anything on the map. And that upper air low continues to pivot across the southern Rockies. We get into the midweek period to the end of the week, and that will slowly drift toward the east. High pressure firmly in control. Nothing in the way of precipitation in our region to even be concerned about. Highs again will be close to normal to slightly above normal. Here's the big fly in the ointment. GFS model wants to lift this up a little bit toward the northeast, and it's been recently keeping most of the models to the south of us. So if this does lift up the northeast, we'll get a little more cloud cover as we go into late next week. That may actually have a decrease in our temperatures, but if this stays to the south of us, we should still be well above normal into the 50s. And really, there is no precipitation with this system. It's very weak. It's not lifting a lot of moisture into our region. As we go out even farther into the future, 8 to 14 day forecast from next Thursday through the following Tuesday shows above normal temperatures working into the plains, and that will be the dominant force the second full week of the month. And in terms of precipitation, a very dry forecast with that big ridge building up into Canada. But by the time we get to the 12th, cold air starts to move into our region. So Troy, overall, not a bad forecast.
Thanks, Al. Finally today, gypsum is a versatile mineral that can be used for manufacturing wallboard, cement, and plaster, just to name a few. But get this, it can also be used as a fertilizer. Warren Dick of Ohio State University joined me to discuss his research on gypsum and provide some insight into its impact on agriculture.
Gypsum is a mineral. It's a naturally formed mineral, naturally found in the environment. It's calcium sulfate. So it incorporates or has two essential elements, calcium and sulfur. And one of the things to know about gypsum is it's moderately soluble, and it's not completely soluble, but it is much more soluble than lime, which is another calcium source. We say it's about 200 times more soluble than lime. And that's very important because it helps that calcium move down into the profile where it can do some very beneficial things for our soil.
And what I think is pretty cool, your research looks at how gypsum can be applied to agriculture. So why is that something that could be beneficial to ag?
Sure. Well, I already mentioned that gypsum contains two essential elements. So I'm going to talk first of all about sulfur. When I started work on gypsum and actually on sulfur in general, people were saying, Warren, why are you doing this research? There's no such thing as sulfur deficiencies in this country. But as we went through the Clean Air Act and we started scrubbing the sulfur out of our flue gases when we were burning our fossil fuels, all that free sulfur we were getting in our rainfall went away. And so we were removing more sulfur every year from our crop harvest. We were leaching more sulfur. We weren't getting as much in the rainfall anymore. So now many states are starting to report deficiencies of sulfur in their crops. And one of the really good sources of sulfur is gypsum. And of course, then the other side of this material is the calcium. And calcium is very beneficial as far as rooting of crops, soil physical properties, helps the infiltration of water and air, aggregates the soil so that infiltration can become more efficient. And so those are some of the benefits that can be captured by applying gypsum to ag soils.
And when you're talking about using gypsum in ag, I'm sure a lot of folks wonder, okay, how would that impact the water quality when it's going down into the soil? Could you speak on that a little bit?
Yes, the way it does is the calcium, well, two ways. One is the calcium helps aggregate the soil, allows much better water infiltration into the soil so you don't get as much runoff. A lot of the phosphorus that ends up in our lakes piggybacks on sediment that's eroded. So if you can get more water going into the soil instead of running off the soil, you decrease the amount of erosion and sediment movement. But the other thing is, especially where we're moving more into no tillage and all the fertilizers are applied on the surface, or even with the 4Rs, maybe under the surface, but the soil is never tilled, you do get a buildup of available phosphorus at the surface. And that can be a good thing in some cases, it helps feed the plant. but every time it rains, some of that phosphorus becomes dissolved, gets into the tile drainage or the surface drains into our rivers and lakes, and it's that available soluble phosphorus which really fuels eutrophication, or that algae formation in our lakes. And so what gypsum does is the calcium reacts with the phosphorus, makes calcium phosphate, keeps that phosphorus, that soluble phosphorus, on the field where you want it. It's still available for plants. The soil test values really don't change a whole lot, so the plants can still take it up, but you're really improving the water quality coming off the fields because you're not having the soluble phosphorus no longer in that water that's coming off the field. So that's how that gypsum really helps provide a benefit. And I know there's some government programs where they are actually cost sharing with farmers to apply gypsum to their soils, especially where there's very heavy phosphorus movement, to help improve the water quality coming off those fields.
Oh, very interesting. So have you found any drawbacks to using gypsum in agriculture?
There are drawbacks, just like anything else. You have to use it effectively and properly, especially on sandy soils. If you apply too much gypsum, that calcium will knock off all your magnesium and other required cations, and so you can get a very imbalanced cation and anion nutrient profile in your soil, and that can cause problems. So you really have to make sure you understand where it's appropriate to use, what is the appropriate rate, so that you don't end up with these imbalances and causing these problems that can occur when you use gypsum as a soil amendment.
Despite the fact that gypsum has been around for over the last 2 centuries, we're still studying its benefits. Good information from Warren. That's going to do it for this week's show. Remember, if you missed a story, be sure to download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. And don't forget, you can get the latest updates on the coronavirus outbreak at covid19.unl.edu. Hope to see you right back here next time. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.